So, full disclosure, we are recording this before November 3rd.
Yes.
So, at the time that you're listening to this, you know more about the election, you who are listening, than we do as we're recording this. So, who knows?
So we will not be making any predictions
No.
during this time.
But I think it's an appropriate time, as as we plan worship services. I don't think we said, let's talk about spiritual leadership the week, right? It timed out that it was right before the election, but it raised a question for me because you were talking about the hard attitude, which says follow spiritual leadership within scriptural limits, and a lot of the practices and whatnot that you talked about with leaders could easily apply to just following all kinds of leaders in an appropriate way, as God has established different leaders, whether it's government or employer or that kind of stuff. He's established all kinds of leaders, but our hard attitude says spiritual leaders, which makes me think of a different category of person. So how did those limits and character qualities, how do I follow well leaders that I wouldn't necessarily categorize as a spiritual leader?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things that I love about the hard attitudes is that they're principles taken straight out of the Bible. And I believe that God's word, the Bible, is like it's a manual for life. What's the operating manual to live by? It's the Bible. What does the Bible say about? Fill in the blank. So there are all kinds of principles that we find in God's word that, because it's a principle, it universally translates into other areas of life. So the hard attitudes are specifically focused. The first four are pretty general to personal relationships, and then the last three are organizationally minded, how we work together in groups and teams and as a church. But you can change the wording slightly, but keep the principle that's there.
Okay.
And you can use it in other contexts. So here's a preview for what we're going to talk about this Sunday. We're going to take like a deeper look at the hard attitudes, and we're going to look at some statements that we came up with a number of years ago with Pastor Harold. There were several people involved in this process that we came up with the 6 high-value management principles. Well, there's 7 hard attitudes,
right.
6 high-value management principles.
Okay.
And it's because we combined 5 and 6.
Okay, yeah.
Usually in your job, you're not giving them money, right? But it's about participating and pulling your weight. So
Gotcha.
we just combine those
Makes
two.
sense.
So I don't have the notes in front of me right now, and I don't have those memorized like I have the hard attitudes, but the last one, number 7 hard attitude, number 6 on the high value management principles is something like follow legitimate leadership within its jurisdiction.
Okay.
So that's the translation of it. And so to your question, something I mentioned on Sunday, and we also looked at it with the Understanding the Time series, is that there are these spheres of stewardship or jurisdiction. So there's the self, there is family, there is church, and there is the state. Well, one of the things that I showed in the Understanding the Time series is kind of a bigger picture of like God's over all of it, and then there were a bunch of other little circles within there that didn't have a label on it. So my job is another one of those circles. School,
Okay.
specific school that I go to. Even some of the things we're experiencing right now, the businesses that we go to, restaurants. There's a level of jurisdiction that they have. It's their business,
right?
So you take the principle from the Bible and you then apply it to the context of the specific sphere or smaller sphere. So let's talk about work for a minute, okay? So I may work for a company, and maybe my boss is a follower of Christ. Maybe he's not. Maybe the owner of the company is a follower of Christ. Maybe he's not. It doesn't matter. I can still follow leadership within the appropriate jurisdiction that they have. So, let's say that I work for a restaurant. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
I'm just making something up here off the top of my head. I work for a restaurant, and I am a shift manager at a restaurant, which means I've got some hosts and some servers that I'm the manager over, and then I've got a manager or managers above me. And let's say we're a chain, a national chain. So there's corporate even,
Yeah, corporate.
And so as the shift manager, my jurisdiction is, I set the hours of the work. I'm making the schedule.
Right.
I hopefully I have some level of authority to have a conversation if an employee decides not to show up for work. Maybe we can talk about their job and restructuring the hours. My bosses above me can, have some jurisdiction over me as to what are the processes that we're going to use and what are the company policies and all these things. But at all times, I still need to live my life within scriptural limits, which means me as the individual who I have ultimate responsibility for myself. If my bosses above me want me to do something illegal, immoral, or unethical, well, it's within my right to not do what they're asking me to do. Me as a shift manager, I should never ask my employee to do something illegal, unethical, or immoral. Another thing, thinking about the jurisdictions, I can set the hours and I can tell my employees, you got to be here at this time to this time, and they need to agree to operate certain ways, but I don't have the jurisdiction to tell them what they do when they're not at work. What TV shows are they going to watch, and how are they going to go on vacation? How do they treat their wife? All that. That's I'm a shift manager at a restaurant.
Right.
That's not within my jurisdiction. Now, here's where things also kind of get interesting, though, is that decisions that we make in certain spheres and arenas can impact them. So maybe I can't tell my employees what to do when they're not at work, but what a lot of people are finding now is that social media and what people are posting on social media when they're not at work,
Right.
if it's in violation to the company's policies and values, well, then now your boss has a window into your life and says, you're not living the values of our organization, or you're doing things contrary to it, so we're going to fire you because you haven't done that. And so, are they making you do things? No, but they're just saying there's consequences to your actions, which we live in a cause and effect world because that's how God set it up. There's consequences to some of the things that we do. So there are certain jurisdictions that we have. I think the other big thing that I mentioned, on Sunday is, Brian, so we're coworkers. I'm your boss. I'm also your pastor. So we can talk about things within the jurisdiction of your work. You can talk to me about spiritual things, maybe even things related to parenting your children. It's outside of my jurisdiction to walk into your house and decide that, one of your kids needs to be in timeout for an hour. That's just not my jurisdiction. So that's how we can translate the principle to other areas.
Well, and one thing I know this has been applied as far as stuff I've heard at Hope. This thing I'm about to say has been mostly applied to marriages, but I think overall it follows the same thing. So, but there's this umbrella of protection that say, you're my boss, I'm your employee. And if you're not asking me to do something that is outside of scriptural limits, there's sort of this protection over me that even if you make a bad decision for the organization, that I have followed with the best of intentions. I've tried to honor your decisions, and I came along to try to support you and make you succeed as possible, but it blew up and didn't go very well. There's still protection for me because I wasn't trying to do an end run around your authority. However, when I do, if I say I don't like that decision at all, I'm going to do something else, I step outside of that umbrella, and then I have to deal with the weather that's coming down, and God does deal with us when we are outside of those responsibilities. So it doesn't always feel good to follow leaders. I think you talked about that. If you and I are in agreement, then we're just walking in the same direction. It's when I disagree that I really am choosing to follow, and that gets a little harder.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that umbrella is a great image. You know, what I was thinking when you were talking is, so there can be a nice sunny day and, you know, the leader's holding an umbrella and some of the followers are in the shade. And then it starts to rain and the leaders or the followers are still under that leadership umbrella, but they're being protected from the rain. And the leader might make a decision that we're going to move in this direction, and now we're going to move from rain to hail. But guess what? It's a titanium umbrella, and it's going to protect you from the hail. But if you decide, as you said, to do an end run, you step out from under that authority. Now you're out there in the hail, not under the titanium umbrella, getting hit in the head with the hailstones. Whereas even though it was hailing because of the decision the leader made, God was still able to bless and protect and even prosper you when you operate under authority. And I think this is one of the things that's just, it's so difficult for us to understand in our day and age as Americans, because we have such an individualistic idea of life. Like, it's just me. It's me and Jesus. There's an element of that because each and every one of us have to make our own decision to follow Jesus, and we're going to be held accountable for our life. But God also, throughout history, has worked through leaders, has worked through groups of people following a leader. And you know, one of the things we find in the scriptures, as go the leaders, so go the people. So you look at God's people during the time period of the kings. Some of the kings were awful, horrible, and God judged the people because of the things that they were doing as they were following the leadership. Other times, the leaders were godly kings. They tore down all the idols and they started following God again. They got back to the law, and as a result, God brought blessing and prospered the people. Now, in the middle of that time period, if there was a good king and generally the people were doing God's will, there still may have been some rogue people doing their own bad things, and God dealt with them individually. But generally then, like in the time period of the kings, if you had a generally good person and a bad king and a bad movement of people, they suffered. So it's just so foreign to our thinking these days.
So that's it. We're done with we've done all 7 of the hard attitudes, but
wait,
you've already talked about we have an 8th week in the series where we're going to sort of look at them as a whole, and we talked about how that may translate outside of the church and still be living those same principles in different spheres that we find ourselves in. But outside of that, is there any kind of preview that you can give for what we can look forward to this coming Sunday?
Yeah, going back to the very first week, I talked about why we called the series True to Real. Is that it's really easy to believe something's true, but until you've experienced it, it doesn't become real for you. And time again in my own life, and as I've talked to people, this living and practicing and doing these hard attitudes is where the truth of God's word moves from just being true to being real. And it was fun hearing some of the testimonies throughout the series of clearing up a relationship. That's where it got real for some people. They actually came to me and asked forgiveness. And I really was mad at them because they had wronged me. Yeah. But now we've been friends for the last 20 years, and maybe that would have been the end of the relationship had that not happened, and, or money. Yeah. That was where it got real. I started to God was mostly in charge of my life. Right. but I had kept him out of my finances. Well, once I got him into my finances, then I saw just how that part of life that couldn't get under control, how God even helped in that area. So what I want to do is I want to take a kind of another sweeping look at the hard attitudes, look back through them. One big thing we're going to do, we've kind of teased this out a little bit through the series, but I want to take actually a few minutes and go through. There's actually an order and a sequence to the hard attitudes. So there's a reason we start with number 1 and work our way to number 7, and they're not in a different order. So we're going to talk about the order of why that order is important and how they build on each other. And then also, we're going to take a look at some specific ways that we can use these hard attitudes in a couple of other big contexts, such as marriage and in the workforce. And we have some slightly different wording for those different contexts, but again, a little bit different words, but it's the same principle that's at work. So excited to look at that. We're going to hear some more stories too, from how God has worked in people's lives as they've decided to say, okay, I'm going to give it a try, and here's what I've learned. All
right. Well, then I invite you to join us to church on Sunday, whether that's online at hopechurch.com. You can find all of the service times there. Or if you're in the Fort Worth area, you can come by 1750 Beach Street. We're right at the intersection of I-30 and Beach Street, right outside of downtown, 10 o'clock. And we will hear the final message of the True to Real series. So until then, have a good week, and we will see you next time.
See ya.